On a single morning in 1929, the heartbeat of the world's wealthiest nation simply stopped. Not because of an invading army, a plague, or a famine, but because numbers on a screen suddenly stopped making sense, marking the beginning of a tragedy often taught as a Great Depression, but which was, in reality, a global financial war fought over the very definition of value. This is the story history textbooks gloss over, omitting the brutal truth that the collapse was a struggle for control over money itself, a war fought not with trenches and mustard gas, but with interest rates, currency devaluation, and printing presses, where the winners and losers were chosen by design. To understand the collapse, one must look at the dazzling mirage that preceded it, the 1920s, a decade of noise, jazz, and rivets driven into rising skyscrapers where America emerged from World War I as a colossus, while Europe lay broken, its treasuries drained and its young men buried. Wall Street replaced London as the financial center of the universe, and the newspapers called it the Roaring Twenties. But beneath the flapper dresses and champagne bubbles, a cancer of artificial prosperity was growing, built on cheap credit and wild speculation fueled by a Federal Reserve barely 10 years old. The fatal flaw was leverage, as banks encouraged average citizens to buy stocks on margin, allowing them to borrow $9 for every one they owned, creating a hallucination of wealth where clerks and factory workers believed they were rich with money they didn't have. When the inevitable correction arrived on Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, the sell orders started as a whisper before becoming a scream, culminating in Black Tuesday when billions in wealth evaporated in hours, leaving men standing on the sidewalks of Wall Street in stunned silence, unable to process that their world had vanished. However, the crash itself was merely the spark. The explosion was caused by the reaction of the Federal Reserve, which, facing a choice between flooding the system with cash or tightening credit to protect the dollar, chose discipline and pain. Shackled to the gold standard, where every paper dollar had to be backed by physical gold, the Fed feared foreign nations would lose faith and demand their gold back. So instead of saving the economy, they strangled it by raising interest rates and tightening the money supply when the world was thirsting for liquidity. The result was a domino effect of catastrophe, where nearly 10,000 American banks failed between 1930 and 1933, leaving thousands of desperate people lining up outside locked doors to find their life savings gone, turning a recession into a total monetary collapse engineered by the very institutions tasked with preventing it. The villain in this tragedy was the gold standard, once viewed as the pride of civilization and the ultimate discipline, which transformed in a crisis from an anchor into a noose, because it forced nations to raise interest rates and cut spending to attract gold back into their vaults, a process called deflation, which is economic suicide. In Britain, unemployment rocketed past 20%, while in Germany, the misery began to rot the foundations of democracy, and in America, factories rusted while gold bars sat useless in dark vaults, proving that the gold standard, designed to create order, instead synchronized chaos by chaining every nation to the same sinking ship. The first cracks in this golden armor appeared in London, where the British Empire, bleeding gold reserves, finally surrendered to reality in September 1931 by suspending the gold standard, a shock that sent the pound falling 30% overnight, but miraculously allowed the British economy to breathe again as exports became attractive and credit loosened. Across the Atlantic, the United States refused to learn this lesson as President Herbert Hoover clung to gold with religious zeal, believing sound money was a moral duty, even as deflation gripped the nation like a vice, causing prices to fall by 1/3, and forcing farmers to pour thousands of gallons of milk into ditches because it wasn't worth shipping, all while millions starved in breadlines. The game only changed in 1933 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office and executed a monetary coup, declaring a nationwide bank holiday to freeze the system before issuing Executive Order 6102, which confiscated private gold from American citizens, forcing them to surrender their coins and bullion to the Federal Reserve for $20.67 an ounce. Once the government held the gold, they revalued it to $35 an ounce, effectively devaluing the dollar by 40%, in the largest transfer of wealth from the citizenry to the state in U.S. history, marking the return of the hidden tax of inflation as a tool of government policy. This devaluation triggered a vicious global currency war as nations raced to the bottom, competing to cheapen their money to boost exports, causing the dollar, franc, lira, and yen to tumble while tariffs skyrocketed and global trade collapsed, turning the 1930s into a fractured world of rival currency zones where globalization reversed and economic warfare paved the way for actual warfare. Economic collapse always breeds monsters, and in Germany, a middle class liquidated by inflation and crushed by deflation turned to Hitler, who promised revenge and revival, while in Japan, militarists seized power, claiming conquest was the only path to survival. And in Italy, Mussolini glorified state control, proving that the Great Depression was not just an economic event but a global reshuffling of power.
By the late 1930s, recovery was visible but engineered, with governments taking command of economies, yet the true end of the Depression came not from policy but from the rearmament for World War II, which transformed the monetary map of the Earth. By the time the smoke cleared, the world's gold was hoarded in Fort Knox, and the US dollar ruled supreme, codified in 1944 at Bretton Woods, where a new system pegged global currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold, burying the old empire of British gold and crowning a new empire of American credit. Historically, the Great Depression was a massive transfer of power, moving control from savers to the state and from free markets to bureaucrats, because the gold standard died not because it failed economically, but because it restricted the political power to manage the economy, and defending it meant austerity and riots, while abandoning it meant inflation and control. If this story feels distant, one only needs to look at the financial crisis of 2008 or the economic response to 2020 to see the modern echo, where central banks, having learned the lesson of 1929, chose to print trillions instead of tightening, trading deflation for asset inflation and propping up a zombie system rather than allowing failure. In 1930, governments were terrified of printing money, whereas today they print without restraint. But both eras end with power concentrated and trust eroded, leaving ordinary citizens to pay the price as their currency buys less and less. The deepest lesson of the Great Depression is that money is a weapon. Under the gold standard, it was a weapon of discipline that could starve a population. And under the modern fiat system, it is a weapon of control that can inflate labor away. But either way, it serves the hands that hold the printing press. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And when debt piles to the sky, speculation runs wild, and central banks act as both arsonists and firefighters, the pattern is returning, revealing that the Great Depression was not just a historical event, but an instruction manual for the modern world. So, the next time you hear about interest rates or a market crash, don't just think of numbers, but think of the deeper war fought in central bank vaults and government debt offices. Because the real battles are no longer fought with bullets, but with the value of everything you own. And we are currently living through the latest campaign of that same invisible conflict.